What if the civilizations we recognize today were not truly the first? Imagine the pyramids along the Nile, the cities of Mesopotamia, the sacred texts of India, and the stone monuments of the Maya. Each of these cultures is often described as a beginning, yet there is another possibility. Perhaps they were later chapters in a much older story, one that began on a land now missing from every map. That land is remembered by a single name, Mu. According to those who preserved its story, Mu was a vast continent stretching across the Pacific Ocean. It was not portrayed as a remote outpost or a forgotten island, but as the very first stage of organized human life. In this vision, Mu was the cradle of civilization, the place where knowledge and order first emerged, long before Egypt, India, or the Americas. The modern idea of Mu first appeared in 1864. Augustus Le Plongeon, an explorer studying Maya ruins, believed that the inscriptions he encountered spoke of a long-lost homeland. He argued that the Maya preserved memories of a continent called Mu, a place that existed far earlier than the great empires known from history. His interpretation was dismissed by scholars, but the seed of the idea had been planted. Once spoken, it lingered. In 1926, the legend reached a wider audience. James Churchward, a British-born writer who had spent years in India and the Pacific, published The Lost Continent of Mu. In it, he described an enormous landmass in the Pacific, home to tens of millions of people. He called it the motherland of mankind, the true origin of culture and learning. According to him, when Mu vanished, its knowledge and traditions spread outward, influencing civilizations across the globe. Churchward insisted that his account was based on evidence. While in India, he claimed to have studied ancient tablets inscribed in a forgotten language. These records, he said, told the story of Mu's greatness and its destruction, but no verified copies of such tablets were ever produced, and mainstream scholars found no reason to accept his claims. Still, his book appeared at a time when lost tombs and buried cities were captivating the public. For readers fascinated by ancient mysteries, Churchward's work offered a new possibility, that all human history might trace back to a single homeland now lost beneath the sea. Academics responded cautiously. Without physical proof, most historians and archaeologists dismissed the story. Geological studies showed no sign of a vanished continent in the Pacific. Even so, the legend persisted. For those willing to imagine it, later civilizations could be seen as distant echoes of a society erased from the earth. And so, the story of Mu endures. Some see it as a mistake, others as a creative invention, and a few as a distorted memory of something real. Whatever the case, the name still raises a question. Was there once a land that nurtured humanity's first civilization, only to vanish and leave behind scattered fragments of knowledge? As we follow the traces of Mu tonight, we look not only at the claims of Churchward and others before him, but also at the reasons this idea has endured. Whether myth, misunderstanding, or faint memory, the story of Mu continues to stand at the edge of history. It invites us to wonder if the true cradle of civilization might not have been in the valleys we know, but on a continent long lost beneath the waves. If these stories stir your curiosity, stay with us, and remember to like and subscribe, so you can return for more hidden chapters of history. If we are to understand why Mu was imagined as the first homeland of civilization, we need to begin with its setting. James Churchward, the writer who gave Mu its most detailed form, described the continent as lying at the very heart of the Pacific Ocean. In his 1926 book, he claimed it stretched nearly 5,000 kilometers from east to west, larger than modern Europe. He wrote that this land supported human life not only in distant prehistory, but 50,000 years ago, at a time when mainstream science says our species still lived in small scattered groups. For Churchward, Mu was no minor island, but the central stage of human origins, the source from which all later cultures would arise. The idea of a vanished motherland had appeared even earlier. In 1879, Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg, a French scholar of Mesoamerican texts, helped bring attention to the Popol Vuh, the sacred narrative of the Quiché Maya. Within its stories of creation and destruction, he suggested there might be echoes of a land that came before, a homeland erased by catastrophe. His reading went beyond traditional interpretations of Maya cosmology. It hinted that behind myth might linger fragments of memory, faint recollections of a great place now gone. Though speculative, his view reinforced the thought that civilizations we know were not first beginnings but survivors of something older. To place Mu in a wider frame, we can look at what archaeology has uncovered in the Pacific. Mainstream research points not to a sunken continent, but to the Lapita culture, a seafaring people who spread across the ocean between 1600 before Common Era and 500 before Common Era. Their pottery, tools and settlement patterns reveal how human communities moved island to island, laying the foundations of Polynesian society. The Lapita evidence shows continuity and adaptation, not sudden inheritance from a lost world. For most scholars, these findings demonstrate how real cultures thrived on small islands rather than on a vanished supercontinent. Still, forbidden and mainstream accounts could not be further apart. While archaeology traced pottery shards and migration routes, Churchward insisted on a civilization of immense scale and antiquity. In his 1931 follow-up, The Children of Mu, he extended his argument, claiming that Egypt, India, and the Maya were not isolated achievements, but all descended from Mu. In his telling, the temples of the Nile, the hymns of the Vedas, and the glyphs of Central America could only be explained by a single point of origin. Mu, he said, was the root, and all known civilizations its branches. Geologists, however, resisted such claims. In 1959, Harold Wellman, a respected New Zealand geologist, studied the Pacific Basin. His surveys revealed deep ocean trenches and volcanic chains, evidence that the Pacific floor was ancient and stable. He argued there was no trace of a sunken supercontinent, and no mechanism by which such a landmass could have disappeared in human time. To mainstream science, the map of the Pacific was settled. It contained islands, seamounts, and ridges, but no missing cradle of humanity. This tension between legend and evidence created a lasting divide. On one side stood scholars, pointing to archaeology and geology to show that civilizations had local beginnings. On the other stood writers like Churchward, who believed similarities across cultures were proof of a single source. For him, the distance between Egypt and the Americas was not separation, but evidence of connection. Survivors of Mu, he imagined, carried their knowledge outward, seeding later societies. The early 20th century also helped shape how these ideas spread. The 1,920 seconds and 1,930 seconds were decades of discovery, when tombs were opened in Egypt, ruins uncovered in Central America, and the public devoured tales of lost worlds. Against this backdrop, Churchward's vision of a vast, drowned homeland fit perfectly with the appetite of his readers. He presented Mu not as legend, but as a missing chapter of human history, an explanation for the rise of the civilizations appearing in headlines. Yet each of his claims met with counterpoints. Linguistics, archaeology, and geology all pointed away from a single lost continent and toward multiple points of origin, where societies developed independently in response to their environments. Still, the story of Mu survived because it offered something grand and simple, a single birthplace, a motherland that predated all known civilizations. The setting of Mu remains more idea than location. To believers, it was the heart of the Pacific, a continent drowned by catastrophe yet remembered in myth. To historians, it is a tale born from misread texts and imaginative reconstruction. Between these two views lies the enduring fascination, the possibility that human memory, through myth and inscription, preserves echoes of worlds that no longer exist. Still listening? Please give this video a like to support us. Accounts of Mu often begin with the scale of its population. In 1926, James Churchward wrote that the continent was home to 64 million people. He described a society divided into 10 great tribes, each with its own identity but all governed under a single authority he called the Sun King. This ruler embodied both political and spiritual power, standing at the center of what Churchward presented as the first organized empire. In his later book from 1931, he added more detail. He described vast stone temples rising across the continent, serving both as sacred centers and schools of learning. Within their walls, priests studied the movements of the heavens, and taught the cycles of time. Rituals honoured the sun, which was seen not only as a fiery body in the sky, but as the supreme symbol of creation itself. Churchward claimed that these temples were also places where symbolic scripts were kept, preserving history and knowledge for generations. Archaeology provides its own perspective on monumental building in the Pacific. On the island of Pohnpei, beginning around 1200 of the Common Era, the city of Nan Madol was constructed. Its foundations rest on a lagoon, with canals and artificial islets supporting massive stone platforms. The basalt columns used in the construction weigh several tons each. Moving and stacking such stones without modern machinery required methods that are still debated today. The site shows that Pacific Island societies could achieve remarkable feats of engineering, reshaping landscapes for both ceremonial and political life. Churchward went beyond stone and ritual in his descriptions. He claimed that the people of Mu discovered ways to harness natural forces. In The Children of Mu, he wrote that they used solar energy and even drew electricity from the atmosphere. He described a technology that captured and distributed this energy, allowing millions to live in abundance. No evidence has ever been found for such devices, but the idea of advanced power in antiquity became one of the most distinctive features of the Mu story. In Churchward's telling, daily life on Mu was complex and vibrant. Farmers cultivated fertile lands that produced food for the vast population. Craftsmen shaped stone, wood, and metal into tools, ornaments, and ceremonial objects. Traders moved goods across the continent, while sailors embarked on long voyages. Knowledge was preserved by priests, both men and women, who studied the stars and maintained records in symbolic writing. Education, he claimed, was widespread, ensuring that religion and science were shared throughout society. Comparisons have sometimes been drawn between Mu and other ancient cultures. In the 1970s, some researchers compared symbols from the Indus Valley, particularly at Harappa, with motifs found in Polynesian art. They suggested that similarities in geometric forms might point to a common origin. Linguists and archaeologists in the mainstream rejected this idea, noting that resemblance alone does not prove contact. Still, these comparisons were absorbed into discussions of Mu, where they were used as supposed evidence of knowledge carried outward from a central homeland. Beyond symbols, traditions of navigation and seafaring across the Pacific provide context for the legends. The Lapita culture, active between 1600 before Common Era and 500 before Common Era, spread pottery with distinctive designs from island to island. These artifacts trace the movements of communities who travelled vast distances with skill and organisation. While the Lapita culture is far removed from the 50,000-year antiquity that Churchward claimed for Mu, it demonstrates how maritime societies could spread ideas and maintain connections across the ocean. The religious system of Mu, as Churchward described it, revolved around reverence for the Sunday. He claimed that the sun was not worshipped as a god in itself, but as a representation of the creative force behind the universe. This belief was expressed in grand rituals, processions, and offerings. Temples were aligned with celestial events, their axes set to solstices and equinoxes. Priests charted the heavens, linking the cycles of the sky with the cycles of life on Earth. He portrayed a society where religion and science were fused, with astronomy serving both sacred and practical purposes. Material culture also played a role in his account. He imagined clothing woven from fine fibres, ornaments of gold and precious stones, and tools made from copper and bronze. He claimed that metallurgy in Mu reached a level unknown in other parts of remote antiquity. Archaeology has found no evidence of such practices in the Pacific, but the claim supported his vision of Mu as a technologically advanced society. The architecture of Mu, according to Churchward, was designed to withstand time. He wrote of massive stone blocks cut and placed with precision, forming walls, terraces, and ceremonial plazas. He described cities laid out with straight avenues and large public spaces that could hold thousands of people. These images find no support in the geological record of the Pacific floor, yet they echo patterns seen in later civilizations, leading some to wonder if Churchward projected the achievements of Egypt or Mesopotamia onto his imagined motherland. In this way, the life and society of Mu were described as a vast population, temples of learning, sun-centered worship, monumental architecture, advanced energy, and far-reaching influence. Each element blends forbidden claims, disputed interpretations, and verified archaeology. Together they create a vision that has fascinated and divided readers for nearly a century. In discussions of Mu, the submerged formation at Yonaguni often returns as a possible piece of evidence. Discovered in 1985 at the far southwestern edge of Japan, it consists of massive terraces and steps lying beneath the waves. Most geologists describe it as a natural structure created by the fracturing of local sandstone, yet supporters of the Mu hypothesis interpret it differently. For them, Yonaguni is not just an oddity of geology, but the remnant of a drowned monument. Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist who spent years surveying the site, even suggested that it could have been part of a temple complex swallowed by the Pacific at the end of the last ice age. To those who believe in Mu, such a cataclysm fits the story of a continent collapsing into the ocean, leaving only scattered ruins at its edges. The monument is therefore woven into the legend of Mu as one of the last visible fragments of that lost motherland, a silent marker on the seabed, hinting that a civilization older than history itself might once have stood where the Pacific now stretches. Long before Yonaguni entered the debate, the idea of written records tied to Mu had already been introduced by James Churchward. In his 1926 book, The Lost Continent of Mu, he claimed to have studied tablets in India known as the Nayakal tablets. He said they were preserved by guardians of ancient wisdom and written in a script unlike any other. According to his account, they described the rise of Mu, its millions of people, and its destruction in a great cataclysm. No scholar ever examined the tablets, and they were never made available for study. For Churchward, however, they were the cornerstone of his story, the physical proof that Mu had once existed. To believers, the Nayakal tablets became not only artifacts but keys to a hidden history, evidence that humanity's true origins had been recorded and then locked away from the modern world. Speculation about Mu did not end with Churchward. In 1969, French writers Louis Pauwels and Jacques Bergier published The Morning of the Magicians, a book that became influential in Europe and America's counterculture. They treated Mu not simply as a sunken land, but as part of a broader vision of forbidden history. In their narrative, Mu and Atlantis could have been connected, perhaps even two versions of the same memory. More controversially, they raised the idea that such civilizations may have been touched by powers beyond the Earth. The suggestion of extraterrestrial influence placed Mu in a cosmic setting, far beyond archaeology or geology. Historians rejected these claims, but the book spread widely, shaping how Mu was imagined during the late 20th century. In those pages, the legend of Mu escaped the boundaries of human history and entered the realm of speculation, where myth, science fiction, and esoteric philosophy overlapped. The reach of Mu's legend also extended into the study of language. In the 1970s, a small group of fringe linguists began comparing symbols and scripts across distant cultures. They pointed to the Rongorongo glyphs of Rapa Nui or Easter Island, noting superficial similarities with Egyptian hieroglyphs. Because Rongorongo has never been fully deciphered, such comparisons were difficult to dismiss outright, even though they lacked evidence. Mainstream linguists argued that resemblance in shape does not prove contact, and that the two writing systems developed independently in very different contexts. Yet the suggestion captured imaginations. What if the people of a remote Pacific island and the builders of the Nile had once drawn on the same tradition? To those searching for traces of Mu, these parallels hinted at a hidden source, a forgotten script from which later civilizations might have drawn their symbols. Other writers took Churchward's idea further, proposing that survivors of Mu carried fragments of its culture to distant lands. In this vision, the seeds of writing, architecture, and myth were scattered after the continent's destruction. Symbols seen in Asia, the Americas, or Polynesia could be the faint echoes of a common origin. Whether through monuments submerged in the sea, tablets never revealed, books that blurred the line between history and speculation, or symbols carved on remote islands, Mu was consistently portrayed as the hidden thread linking cultures across oceans. Do you believe Mu was a real homeland of civilization, or only a legend? Share your thoughts in the comments, and leave a like if you enjoy these journeys into the past. Legends of Mu do not stop at its achievements or mysteries. They also speak of a sudden and violent downfall, In James Churchward's account, the end of Mu was as dramatic as its rise. Writing in 1926, he described a world-shaking catastrophe that shattered the continent. He claimed that great earthquakes opened vast fissures in the land, while volcanoes erupted in chains across the Pacific. The very crust of the earth, he said, collapsed under its own weight, dragging cities, temples, and fertile fields beneath the waves. According to his description, the destruction took place in a single night of terror. Tens of millions of people perished, and the empire of the Sun King, which he called the first great society of mankind, was swallowed by the sea. Churchward's story was not unique in suggesting sudden ruin. Across Polynesia, island traditions preserve tales of ancestral homelands that vanished beneath the ocean. In the Marquesas, oral histories collected in the 18th and 19th centuries speak of a place called Hiva. It was remembered as the cradle of the people, a land where ancestors lived before being driven out by rising seas and violent storms. Some versions said Hiva was broken apart by an earthquake, while others described repeated tempests and floods that made it unlivable. Families were forced to sail to new islands, carrying chants, songs, and genealogies that preserved the memory of a homeland lost forever. For later believers in Mu, these stories of Hiva seem to echo Churchward's claim that the Pacific once held a great land destroyed by earthquakes and volcanoes. Accounts from other parts of the Pacific also speak of islands swallowed by the sea. In Hawaii, chants refer to lands now beneath the waves. On Rapa Nui, better known as Easter Island, traditions recall long voyages from places that no longer exist. While these narratives cannot be taken as literal evidence of a continent-sized homeland, they reveal how deeply the idea of loss and displacement runs through the oral heritage of the Pacific. To believers in Mu, such fragments are seen as cultural memories of the same catastrophe that Churchward described. Mainstream geology approaches the question differently. In 1998, seafloor mapping projects provided detailed surveys of the Pacific Basin. Using sonar and satellite measurements, researchers charted the ridges, trenches, and volcanic arcs that shape the ocean floor. Their findings showed no trace of a sunken continental block. The Pacific crust is primarily oceanic, thinner and denser than continental crust, and it has remained stable for tens of millions of years. While volcanic islands rise and erode, and seamounts sink beneath the surface, the idea of a continent vanishing within human memory has no support in these maps. In 2001, further research came from geophysicist Adam Malouf of Princeton University. Conducting surveys in Samoa, Malouf examined volcanic deposits and seamount chains in the region. His results confirmed what geologists had long argued. The Pacific Basin is a field of volcanic activity, with isolated fragments produced by hotspots in the mantle. These fragments are not pieces of a drowned supercontinent, but small volcanic platforms scattered across the ocean floor. His studies reinforced the conclusion that there is no evidence for a continent the size of Mu collapsing into the sea within the time frame of human history. Despite this, the legend of Mu's destruction continued to develop within forbidden history. From the 1,930 seconds through the 1,970 seconds, writers expanded Churchward's catastrophe into a global story of diffusion. According to these accounts, survivors of Mu did not all perish. Some escaped on ships, sailing across the Pacific and beyond. They carried with them fragments of knowledge, traditions, and skills that later reappeared in distant lands. In this vision, the refugees of Mu became the bearers of civilization itself. The theory of diffusion linked Mu's fall to the rise of Egypt, India, and the Americas. Proponents argued that the sudden appearance of advanced architecture, astronomy, and symbolic writing in these regions could be explained if groups of survivors carried their traditions outward. The pyramids of Egypt, they suggested, reflected building methods inherited from Mu. The hymns of the Vedic tradition in India were seen as descendants of spiritual teachings preserved from the lost continent. In Central America, the calendars and monumental temples of the Maya were interpreted as echoes of Mu's science. During the mid-20th century, this idea appeared in popular books and lectures. Writers claimed that the survivors travelled in stages, first to islands in the Pacific, then onward to Asia and the Americas. The diffusion model was used to explain similarities in myths of a great flood in pyramid-like structures across continents, and in astronomical traditions found in distant cultures. While mainstream archaeology explained these as independent developments shaped by local environments, forbidden history insisted that they were traces of a single origin scattered after the destruction of Mu. The disaster itself was described in vivid terms. Churchward spoke of great waves that swept across the land as the crust collapsed. Later writers imagined volcanic eruptions darkening the skies, lightning storms splitting temples apart, and survivors fleeing in boats as the land tore itself to pieces. These dramatizations built on the core claim of a single night of destruction, transforming it into a mythic event remembered in fragments across the world. Geology, however, remains firm in its conclusions. The Pacific Ocean is too deep and too old to conceal a lost continent. The crust is oceanic, not continental, and the ridges and trenches mapped in the 20th century show no sign of sunken land masses of continental scale. Studies such as Maloof's in Samoa confirmed that the features of the seafloor are volcanic in origin. Islands can be born and lost, but continents do not simply vanish within human time. If you are still here with us, press like so we know you are listening. Mu did not disappear entirely after Churchward. The name survived in glimpses of popular culture, from a reference in the 1969 film The Valley of Gwangi to the island called Mu in the 1994 video game Illusion of Gaia, to the 2003 book Lost Continents by L. Sprague de Camp. These mentions kept the word alive, but the deeper importance of Mu lies in how it can be used to reflect on human memory, natural disaster, and the lessons that myths carry for the present. In 2013, anthropologists studying Polynesian traditions suggested that myths of drowned homelands might preserve memories of real environmental events. Songs and genealogies about vanished islands may echo the effects of rising seas or volcanic upheavals. More recently, in 2025, research in the Journal of Pacific Archaeology argued that these traditions can be read as cultural memory of climate change. For scholars, Mu has become an example of how people process catastrophe through story, holding on to identity when the land itself is unstable. The story of a mother civilization swallowed by the sea also serves as a warning. Earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and rising oceans are not confined to myth. They are realities of our planet. History provides stark reminders. Thera in the Aegean destroyed by eruption around 1600 before Common Era. Pompeii buried in 79 of the Common Era. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami that devastated coastal communities. Mu may not be a proven continent, but as a tale it illustrates how vulnerable societies can be when confronted with natural forces. The legend invites reflection on preparedness. Modern science now offers tools that ancient people lacked: seismographs, tsunami warning systems, satellite monitoring of sea level, and coordinated disaster planning. The lesson is that knowledge must be applied. Societies cannot prevent earthquakes or volcanic eruptions, but they can reduce their impact through foresight and preparation. For modern audiences, Mu carries both sides of this message. On one hand, it appeals to the imagination with visions of a vanished motherland. On the other, it urges respect for the power of earth and ocean to reshape history in a single moment. Whether Mu was real or not, the story reminds us that human achievement rests on fragile ground. Its value lies in prompting us to invest in research, to strengthen readiness, and to recognize that survival is always tied to the rhythms of the planet. Among the many interpretations of Mu, one of the most intriguing is the suggestion that it was never truly separate from Atlantis. Some writers have proposed that both names point to the same memory, a single ancient civilization remembered in different forms. In this view, Mu and Atlantis are not rival legends, but reflections of the same forgotten world, preserved through myths on opposite sides of the globe. If that is true, then the question is larger than the fate of one lost continent. It asks whether human memory itself can carry echoes of events that occurred in the distant past. Could it be that stories of floods, drowned lands, and sunken kingdoms are fragments of a shared recollection, passed down through cultures and reshaped across millennia? If so, the legend of Mu may not be a mistake or an invention, but a distorted remembrance of humanity's earliest stage. The mystery lies in whether such a homeland could ever be found. If it once existed, its ruins may rest beneath miles of ocean, forever beyond our reach. Or perhaps it never existed in stone and soil at all, but only in the imagination of people searching for a beginning. If the collective memory of our species is hiding a motherland, can it ever be uncovered? Or will it remain forever out of reach, lingering only as a dream we tell ourselves before sleep? If you have stayed with us until now, thank you for listening to this journey through legend and possibility. If you would like to support the channel, a simple like and a comment help more than you might imagine. And if you wish to join us again, subscribe so you will not miss the next story waiting in the shadows of history. For now, close your eyes, rest well, and good night.